How difficult is it for a normal swordswoman to switch from a double-handed blade to a cavalier rapier? For a normal swordswoman to reach the standard of a house cavalier primary, you'd need years. For Nav, 3 months. Here Gideon died briefly of gratification. She revived only due to the rising horror consequent of everything else. And she'd be up to the standard of the meanest, most behindhand cavalier alive. Oh, nonsense, said Harrow languorously. She's a genius. With the proper motivation, Greta could wield 2 swords in each hand and 1 in her mouth. While we were developing common sense, she studied the blade.
You're listening to Nun Pod with Left Grief, Episode 4.
She studied the blade!
Straight off of her crushing defeat in the last chapter, Gideon spends a week being paralytically depressed in her cell in the dark, not bothering to eat or move. And then Harrow calls upon her to take up a new task.
And before Harrow has even said a word, Gideon is very prepared to how she currently feels about it. Just like, no. But like very quickly, Harrow continues this angle of like, I have work for you. Like this is a line that Harrow has kind of, I imagine, given to Gideon before. And it to me frames the fact that Gideon holds a unique position in relationship to the house. She has a unique direct relationship to Harrow. Like Harrow's like, I have work for you. Like specifically you, Nav.
Mm-hmm.
It does feel very personal. And it feels like there's a precedent for Harrow being like, hey, Griddle, there's a thing that I'm expecting you to do. And that when like Harrow is standing in front of the door because she's seen this before, right? This interaction has happened before. And I love all the really subtle ways that Muir establishes like relationship precedent of just like Gideon was really fast to respond here. Awakes out of her depression where she has just been like slugging around miserably. Like Crux snapped the security cuff back on her ankle. Not a single mention of any resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Just quietly eating goo until Harrow shows up and she's like, fuck you, I'm miserable, go away. We continue on here in their conversation. Our first example of Harrow actively using her bone accessories and Gideon being familiar with this particular maneuver. Enough
Absolutely.
That in the dark, she can hear it. And she's like, no. Like
she knows exactly.
Yeah, she knows exactly what's happening. We knew that she was familiar with this in the fight where she's like, Harrow's taking off her jewelry. This is this very vulnerable action. But here it's like Harrow has weaponized her jewelry against Gideon regularly and routinely, and in this specific way before.
Getting back to your previous question on one of our earlier episodes of why does Harrow need Gideon so much? Gideon might provide the grit that allows Harrow to develop because she's not refused anything. She is, on one hand, hereditary nobility, and on the other hand, her parents are urging her to access even these extremely high-level necromantic texts. Nothing is being forbidden her on any level.
Yeah.
Except Gideon. Gideon forbids her things. Gideon won't let her into her cell. And so all she wants in the world is to get in there, and she's got to use all her little skills to get in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
We get some exciting new materials clues in this chapter. We get the nutrient paste, which tells us a little bit about food systems and maybe how the ninth is getting its protein.
Mm-hmm. Nutrient paste makes me think of, first of all, like athletic goo, like the kind of goo pouches that I might pick up for like a long bike ride. But that doesn't actually make sense because we've talked about the high tech versus low tech difference here. And this feels more like a industrially produced, large scale military ration type thing.
That's how I interpret it as well. It does also seem like she's basically eating bouillon. That this is a dense paste that usually goes into a soup, and she is just eating it straight, which I think is not how it is meant to be consumed. And so she might be eating very small amounts of very calorie dense paste.
Yeah. I don't remember this calorie dense paste coming up again. It continues to emphasize the kind of isolatedness to the way that the ninth is treated. It's very like I wonder if Gideon routinely does this where she's just like food is just fuel for muscles and because she knows that she just has access to this.
I
Food,
took it as the ultimate depression meal
yeah.
that it stops her from having to leave her cell to go to whatever mess hall there is
It stops her from having
and
to leave her bed.
preparing food. And yeah, and it's this if she's eating something that's basically equivalent to bouillon, she has to eat the least less of it because it's going to be so dense. And so it's also engaging as little as possible with those self-care tasks.
Yeah.
I assume she also hasn't bathed during this week.
Yeah, it like she's not engaging with her body in any way that she can. And
Except
she
she's still working out a little.
which like honestly maybe I'll try next time. I'm feeling really sad. I'm like I can't actually do a full push-up, but like I'll be like I'm going to save the ninth house. I'm going to save the ninth house and see if it makes me feel better.
We also get confirmed electric lights.
Confirmed electric lights. Um haloed faintly. Again,
Mhm.
these cool. I love the way like I feel like Capson really loves lighting design. It feels like a little like it's like a little bow that she puts on different scenes. Yeah, we have dingy electric lights kind of lighting up everything, sorta.
Mhm.
Um, and then maybe neon in the church. Who knows?
Yeah. We also get confirmed animal agriculture, which I'm very excited about because Iglamine is wearing wool and a wool jacket and wool gloves, if well cared for and well made, could last for decades, but not centuries. So if Iglamine has fully usable wool jacket and wool gloves that she's using while working, there are sheep or alpaca or there's woolly animals and they are being agricultured somewhere.
Which to me, I'm just like all of the crocheted trim. Like I'm just imagining like fine crocheted trim on Harrow's like official garbs. Like there's just because it implies all these other possibilities of arts and technology. I mean, wool is a thing where we have very low tech agriculture there in the ninth, but textile production usually involves a lot of different types of technology, and it makes sense at an empire level to have that centralized more than it is to individual planets, especially one that's already clearly like deprioritized in terms of refined and like ready to use materials.
Given the scarcity of biologic materials like paper, I have to imagine that a wool coat would be very expensive on the ninth.
It's curious to think about how like sufficient agriculture to have wool is common, but I live somewhere where we have a softwood lumber industry that like makes tons of pulp. We have so much toilet paper in my country, and it's a bigger industry than wool. So the exception that paper is not available is kind of curious because it means like is it that there isn't space to plant? Is it that there isn't climatic conditions to grow trees? Like what is the actual reason why sheep are fine but trees are not?
Paper is very heavy, and so it's
Mm,
possible that if trees cannot grow on the ninth, which I think on a climatic level is very plausible, it would be more efficient to transport flimsy than paper because paper is so dense.
yeah.
If you have to transport your products through space, the weight and density of those products is going to matter quite a lot.
And you can vacuum pack a lot of wool.
It's true.
Um,
But we also know that Gideon is not wearing wool. Gideon wears synthetics.
this like makes me think about sumptuary law.
Mm.
Sumptuary law existed really predominantly, in my knowledge, in the Renaissance eras, where we were developing in the Western world a lot more technology around textiles. And so fine textiles from Asia, like China's silk technology was being imported into Italy. So as these luxury items became more prevalent, who was allowed to use them was part of how they were shared. They were status indicators. So wool as an expensive item, like, is this something that Iglemine would have been like acquired during her military service? Because the ninth is not really affluent enough that this really seems like a common. They take a lot of pains to talk about like the draping and kind of nature of the things that Harrow wears, but I don't believe we've covered the actual material yet.
I don't think that we have any, I don't know that we get any insight on the material of what Harrow wears. We know that it's embroidered and it's got lace.
That means that we can assume one is that the embroidered one probably is woven rather than knit.
Mm-hmm.
So just kind of telling you what kind of machines are involved with its production. Lace, if we're kind of extending this sumptuary analogy, we want to compare like machine made lace versus handmade lace because they're status items. Crochet wool lace is really what's coming to mind, where I'm like, ooh, pretty crochet trims, obsessed. But to me, it's the draping language about Harrow's garments. And this also extends into the draping language about lictor garments, where it doesn't talk about the materials. It talks about the impression that you get from the person wearing it, how it operates on their body.
And the volume of fabric is also historically in a European context a way of expressing wealth, particularly in the earlier medieval period where there wasn't as much complicated technology in terms of fabric manufacture. So everybody was wearing about the same kind of clothing. The wealthier people wore more of it. And
Yeah.
so seeing Harrow wearing these voluminous robes and these layers is also a way of expressing, at least performing wealth, although we know that her wealth is illusory.
Yeah. We get a totally different topic. We get a little hint here about different levels of necromantic adepts.
Hmm.
Um, we talk about Gideon's tooth,
Yes.
which, thanks, Crux, one of the nuns jammed her tooth in too hard. We have a similar example here, maybe to Iglemine's leg, where we have different levels of skill in terms of the necromantic arts and discipline. So we have this healing, bone modifying, fixing necromancy. In general, the nuns have not been given much flattering language. It is kind of implied that they're the best they got.
As a medical sociologist, I also want to highlight that she is indentured and it might not be a skill issue.
Might not be a skill issue. It might be on purpose.
It might be careless.
Right.
People who are devalued in society receive worse medical care. So it's possible that this nun who put her tooth in too hard just didn't give a shit. Whereas that same nun might have done perfectly adequate dentistry if it needed to be done to harrow her.
Which, like, Catholic nuns, in the context of taking care of children, are notorious for drastically varying treatment based on how they feel about the child. My mother went to Catholic school. She has stories about being physically abused by nuns, but you also have, these anecdotes of individuals being like set aside and treated exceptionally. Societally, like, nuns are not people who have a lot of individual power. And I think this is one of those things where they're like, I have power over someone.
Right.
I get to choose how kind and gentle this behavior is. I get to choose how cruel and painful this behavior is.
Yeah, I think that the moment where we talk about Gideon's bad dentist experience also kind of undermines what we've been saying about Gideon having healing powers because
Yeah.
her rib still hurts. And if she broke her rib a week ago, she could still have healing powers. They are simply not instant. But this brings up that when Gideon is injured, she does not necessarily bounce back all the way right away.
Yeah. Like, what would her body have done if it had just been left to its own devices in terms of healing?
I broke a rib in a sword fight and did not get adequate medical care because I was young and poor and also stupid. And so my rib remodeled badly. And I will say that for someone without God-derived healing magic, that was an experience that lasted months.
This also, like, another factor might be that they don't know that Gideon has healing powers. So if someone is able to do something themselves and you insist on another party doing it for them, that is disruptive.
Maybe, yeah. I think we'll see. I I have heard people question whether Gideon has kind of any healing powers, and I know that you didn't really think about this. For me, the evidence of this comes up really strongly in the the tests that we see later, particularly the avulsion chamber. So we'll kind of touch on evidence as it comes up, but I wanted to highlight this evidence against my position
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, totally.
So most of this chapter we spend deep in the monument under Dreerbur looking for swords.
Swords, 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 swords. This is probably one of my most favorite to remember chapters in just the idea of this like catacomb full of like musty bundles of bones and like caches of swords. So there's like all of this texture that's happening for me. There's like this gritty ground, there's these like dusty alcoves, there's these rusty swords. I hear this sound like of a Gleminate clanking through this pile of rusty swords. And like if you've heard a pile of metal, that's one thing. A pile of rusty metal interacting with each other is a different sound. A chipped metal interacts with its surfaces differently than smooth metal. So like swords that have sharp, well-polished blades being rattled through are going to sound drastically different than a bunch of old, archaic, decaying pieces of metal that are barely swords anymore.
This space, first of all, fascinates me visually. I want to go in there. I want to see it. I tag me in art about this, hashtag nunpod. But the pillars and the alcoves and the niches, I want to know everything about what this place is like and feels like and looks like. But the way that this place is managed seems like it's so emblematic of the sort of short-sighted wastefulness that characterizes so many of the Ninth's management decisions that we know about. Because they know that they use, first of all, human bodies, and second of all, the possessions of the dead to furnish the living. And yet they have let all of these swords go rusty. And so is it just that they have recently started trying to comb through the grave goods of the holy dead? Is it like, does this reflect a change in society? Does this reflect a violation?
Yeah.
Is this something that shouldn't be happening?
I think the treating it as totally treating things that are enormous deviations from their normal practices seems like a thing that has been normalized since Harrow's parents died. Like the desperation that the decision making in this house has had, I mean, started before Harrow was born. I think the short-sightedness has a degree of snowballing to it as things have been clearly falling apart for decades. Because if it made sense for this to be their normal system of storing bodies, storing old weapons, it to me implies that they used to have enough resources that they could waste these things. Like something has happened where there used to be a flowing population through the ninth, enough that they could be wasteful. But they did not need to change this particular type of decision making. They did not need to reflect on the consequences of the way things were being done given the new circumstances until this moment.
They are looking for something like Ordis's grandmother's sword, which means they're not looking for Ordis's grandmother's sword, and they probably know where Ordis's grandmother is buried. So why not her sword? And yeah, like also like why not Mortis's sword? Because he's not using it.
The idea of them being belonging to previous cavaliers feels a little bit too far. Like, I can't imagine them being like, well, let's just grab Matthias Nonius's sword. It's probably fine if it was buried with him. Like, that seems almost like a little bit of a violation.
Yeah, I think as you pointed out, the fact that it used to be graved goods and now it is being scavenged suggests that there's a point economically where the ninth went from any new swords person can have a sword acquired from outside the house to we can no longer do that. That's no longer practical.
And I think this happened within the leadership of Harrow's parents. I think the desperation that their decision making led them to was them realizing this pivot and trying to somehow salvage it.
I would tend to suspect that this was a gradual deterioration of the house, but it's hard to say how long that's been going on because, as you say, this could be something that has struck in the last century. It could also be something that's been going on for 500 years. It could also be something that has been gradually happening to all the houses for the entire span since the revival, which I think is probable on the level of what we know about what Tamsin Muir is saying about necromancy.
And about empire. I think
Hmm.
it is really, really probable to say that that last point is true. And there are probably smaller, more localized accelerating factors for the ninth itself. The emperor created this whole system and setup that is not actually sustainable in the long term. It is showing its crumbles. The other houses are still maybe somewhat insulated from this, but the ninth is feeling those consequences very, very literally, both in population and in material.
It seems like Iglamine is feeling pretty ambivalent about this task. And it also seems like the task goes beyond picking a weapon for Gideon. The scene is set up describing Iglamine as ransacking the grave goods, which, is a very loaded framing. But it also immediately describes her as having a particularly po-faced, battle-weary expression as she picked through the swords.
So the way that these swords have been preserved was not with care.
Mhm.
But it does say here that Aglemone treated them with care. So
Yeah.
she has a different relationship to these catacombs or just swords in general.
Next to her was a basket of daggers and a handful of knuckle knives. So, like, Gideon doesn't need a basket of daggers. So it seems like they're using this opportunity to sort of generate, like, they don't routinely come down here and scavenge. This is a particular moment of scavenging, and they don't want to do it again. They want to find everything that's worth saving and go ahead and start storing it differently.
There's a bit of thought beyond arming Gideon
Yeah,
going into Aglemone's process here.
it seems like it. And Iglamine sets the crappy swords aside with care, but then when she's done, she takes the case full of the swords that she's chosen and puts it over her shoulder, and she kicks the unwanted swords back into a niche. So the grave goods, even the ones that are not being selected, there's a real, in some ways they're being treated with care. In some ways, Iglamine is like really taking this moment seriously. But ultimately she's just like fucking whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you want to talk about swords?
I want to talk about swords. There are some wonderful quotations in this chapter that I'm like, okay. So, for context, I have a friend who knows the sword fighter who was the model for the Gideon the Ninth cover. And so, in learning this, I was like, well, obviously, Muir sat down with this woman and just like talked shop, being like, here's a bunch of questions I have about swords. And some of these feel like direct quotes from someone who would know.
I was
But
just excited that basket hilts were mentioned. That's such a silly thing, but I was like, she knows about our thing.
and specifically for the people who want to become sword nerds out there, the classic basket hilt that is used in a lot of the fan art is called a Shianova guard. Got a very distinct swoopiness to it. I think it's
Claire,
S.
how long have you sword fighted?
If you include my baby larping years, we're looking at least 15 years. In the weapons referred to in these books, I want to say more like 8.
I would say that I have 10 or 12 years of total sword experience and about 2 years of rapier.
I spent 3 or 4 years in doing rapier training. It is not my particular preferred weapon, but I still have a rapier. They mechanically are so distinct from the longsword that Gideon loves and specializes in. And one of the clearest ways to see this kind of, to me, class distinction in different weapons is the proximity in which you are to your opponent while fighting. Rapiers mean that you are generally quite a bit further back. You're less likely to receive a percussive blow. You're less likely to be punched. You're less likely to be pommel struck. These rapiers are weapons that people do big flourishes and can wear fancy clothes while using, and they're historically associated with a bit more status and a bit more display of wealth. They're more labor intensive to manufacture because these basket hilts, these sweepy guards, just have more pieces that you have to put together. While a longsword, it talks about them as an infantry weapon. There are some examples in history where longswords were used in war contexts. There's some examples where they're used in tournament contexts.
Isn't it the case that with a long sword, you want to press in on a person with a long sword because they're trying to keep you away? Isn't they're trying to control space? I did not do longsword.
I have done some longsword. My specialty is in a single-handed sword that is kind of the immediate ancestor of the division between rapiers and like stuff like sabers. There's a little bit of a difference in terms of how you move, but the idea with a longsword in war context is that you're in a group, you're in a melee. You need big sweeping, circling gestures to try and keep space around you, to try and do as much damage as possible rather than precise gestures. Rapiers are about precision. Longswords are about big movement and big impact. And they're also a little bit wrestly and grapply. If you are fighting one-on-one with a longsword compared to one-on-one with a rapier, you are going to either end it very quickly with one large heavy blow, or you are going to close very quickly and going to be within grappling range. There is no safe middle ground there. I really want to talk about knuckle knives. So when I was working on my Gideon cosplay, I spent so much time trying to prototype knuckle knives. As a sword fighter, I am very brawly. I use a single-handed sword that also complements with grappling. I fight in contexts where I'm not actually allowed to punch and elbow people in the face. But if I had my messer and knuckle knives on my left, boy, oh boy, would it get messy. And I think this is one of the ways that I really immediately related to Gideon, where, first of all, in this book, I was like, I remember when I came across, I'm like, what's a knuckle knife? What are knuckle knives?
How do you interpret knuckle knives?
So I think of them like a fingerless glove with claws. So if you punch someone, you get 4 slashes.
I always imagined it like a punch dagger.
I think a punch dagger is maybe where the idea comes from. But if we're thinking about, okay, so we have daggers and knuckle knives as offhands to rapier. That's the kind of way that they're being framed here.
Mm-hmm.
Daggers are used in conjunction with rapier, often for control and for coping with close combat scenarios. Because normally with a rapier, you're going to be at a fair distance. But if you are now, oopsie, way too close, you have a short range thing that you can do some damage with while you are binding up their other weapon with your bound up weapon, because your rapier is now useless to you unless you're pommel striking someone in the face, which may not be possible if you're bound up in their rapier. So we have an offhand that a dagger, better for controlling a sword. I don't think knuckle knives would be really good at controlling a sword. I think knuckle knives are really focused on doing damage.
Whereas the sort of Wolverine style glove would be better at catching a blade.
I actually meant the opposite. I think a Wolverine style glove would, like, if I caught a blade with a Wolverine style glove, my knuckles are aligning it to my center of body. It would be, I would have to either go above my head, completely across my body or straight down,
Mm-hmm.
all of
That's
which
a
are
big
kind
movement.
of awkward and big.
Yeah.
So I think in the case of a knuckle knife, your control of their threat, of their weapon, is with your main weapon. And
Right.
you are now so close that you are doing soft tissue damage, because knuckle knives they wouldn't have the kind of acceleration of force based on like big sweepy movements. Because when you have, what is it? At the center of I'm going to use a clock as the example. The closer to the center of the clock you are, technically the slower that part is moving. As you
Correct.
get further out on the hand, you have more speed. You have this accelerating force. So this is a force multiplier that makes cutting easier when you're doing a long sweeping strike with something further away from you. You can see this also happen in large mass weapons, like I want to say a great axe, big things that swing out far. If you are extending your force just like inches out from your hand, you are not going to be really going through bone. You want soft tissue.
Totally.
So, I mean, that also makes me think of like, okay, if you have a knuckle knife and you're doing that, maybe there's also some like metal plates going along the defensive line. So like along the outside of the forearm and the outside of the hand, as well as the offensive elements of the Wolverine style blades from the knuckles, because then you could block with the forearm and then sweep. I really need to fight someone with knuckle knives and rapier and kind of do some research on this.
What's your main offhand?
My fist.
Great.
My main offhand is my fist. So I fight in a way that I bind and close, and then some kind of percussive strike, either with a pommel or my fist, or my actual focus is on non-lethal and like minimal harm sword fighting. I study from a manual by a guy named Johannes Lichtenauer, and a lot of his stuff looks like de-escalation in a way. There's this one hilarious move where it's like 3 people tossing someone in a bag, but there's a whole bunch of steps that lead up to that. Mm-hmm. And he lays them all out. It is harder to do less damage with a sword on purpose than it is to do accidentally more damage.
Sure.
So which is why my offhand is a hand, because it is the thing that I have the most control over. If I put a buckler in there, I just punch people in the face with it.
I've done a little bit of sword and buckler, but my main offhand was a second sword.
Nice. When we get to Camilla, I look forward to hearing about that. So I was talking earlier about what I think are direct pull quotes from a sword fighter that Nir talked to, talking about Ortis's sword. Surely his sword must be good. God knows, says Aglamini. It was heavy oil amalgam, which I don't even, amalgam?
Amalgam just means mixed.
Oh.
I tried to find whether you can make metal that is amalgamated with oil, and that is not a technology that, as far as I can tell, currently exists.
The closest thing that I can think of would be like a polycarbonate sword. So there's companies out there that make training weapons that it's like it looks like a black plastic, but it's a really specific material used for a lot of training weapons, and that is a petrochemical based plastic.
If you go looking for those, don't support cold steel.
Yeah, fuck those guys. If you want recommendations for training weapons, I recommend Purple Heart Armory. So heavy oil amalgam, but the thing that really, really sticks out to me is, and it had a rubber tip. He has a sport weapon, and this is not just like, this is a sport weapon, but there is like controversy within the sword community about rubber tips. It is this weird kind of like, does it make it safer? Does it make it more likely to cause injury within training contexts? It is this thing of like, it had training wheels, is what Aglamini is saying. This is a tricycle, or this is a bicycle with training wheels. Ortis was never really given a real sword. Maybe it was pretty. Maybe it looked nice, because you can get some real pretty training swords, but it never had the capacity to do what a Cavalier was expected to be able to do.
Well, and I think that brings up the questions that we have about what is a Cavalier meant to do, because Ortis never expected to go off-world. Who was he going to fight on the 9th? A sport sword could be fine for him, and clearly kind of was fine for him, but it's not going to do it for Gideon in this circumstance.
Yeah. Do you have any idea what powder means in Sword and Powder? Because I have a little bit of an idea, but
pocket sand.
Pocket sand. Pocket sand has many references in historical fighting manuals. This is a known thing, but powder feels like almost like it would be like some specific kind of sand.
I have heard people suggest that powder is meant to be bone powder in order for the necromancer to use it as necromancy supplies. I don't think that that's accurate for two reasons. First
Okay.
of all, Harrow Hark is the only person who can make use of fine bone like that. And even then, we know that she can do bone chips, but I don't know if powder is enough for her. And second of all, that's what the panniers are for. So we know that the Ninth Cavalier typically brings big saddlebags full of bones for their necromancer to use, and that doesn't look like powder. And it's interesting in this case that that's not even discussed as an option. Like that was Mortis's offhand. He had the panniers. Panniers, incidentally, is also a costuming term for hoop skirts that make your hips all wide, which I find delightful.
So I'm now imagining Mortis in like big, serious Cavalier clothes with like cage hip
18th
panniers,
century. Yeah,
like a
yeah.
French aristocrat,
Me too,
and then like
always. I always
bones
imagine
sticking
that.
out. Fan art, please. Can I get Mortis dressed as a French aristocrat?
So, yeah, I love the discussion about offhand. We don't take Buckler seriously. We don't even discuss panniers. Aglamine wants powder or knife, right?
She says knuckle or knife, but a knife, I think, my lady, her captain said again with more gentle deference. This
Yeah,
is
Harrow wants either powder or a chain. Harrow only thinks in terms of control.
and this also is starting to paint a picture of what kind of scenarios they imagine a cavalier may be facing. Knife or knuckle. The knife will be impossibly difficult to adjust as it is. I think that has to do with Gideon adjusting to a two-handed dynamic because using a dagger as your offhand is fairly technical.
Yeah. I think she
Powder
would also have a lot of trouble picking up Buckler in 3 months.
and even chain, like if you've ever fought with something that is not rigid, you know how likely it is that you're going to fucking get yourself in the process. Like play with nunchucks, but use foam ones because you will whip yourself in the face.
I've never
Um,
seen someone fight with a chain as a control weapon, but I have seen a number of people fight with a cape as a control weapon, kind
mhm,
of similar to Mercy Morn's net.
mhm.
And it's real cool when people pull it off, but it does look hard.
At the end of the day, if you're training with a longsword or a rapier, you're learning very conventional sword mechanics that don't translate particularly immediately to highly mobile things like nets or chains. So I want to start because I used to teach this workshop where we'd look at a sword fight in a book and we talk about what was happening narratively and what decision making process you could see happening. Harrow and Aglemine are both envisioning different combat scenarios.
Mhm.
And Aglemine says right here, a chain in close melee is more of a danger to you than anyone else.
Can you tell me about the stories that they're each imagining?
Harrow is thinking about control. I think Harrow is thinking about, let's see here, chain. That's actually trickier than I imagined. I might have to revisit that. Aglemine is a military veteran, so she would be expecting more messier scenarios. Those will be what she's familiar with. That's probably also how Gideon was trained with an infantry weapon. That is not where Harrow asserts her control. I think Harrow imagines more intimate, personal conflict, like the fight that comes up with Nibirius later down the road.
Do you think it's possible that Iglamine is imagining more defensive situations and Harrow is imagining more traps?
I think there's something to that. Either and like Harrow doesn't exactly like direct and fair conflict. So I think there's something to what you're saying there.
Aglamine is also explicitly talking about a close melee, which is interesting given the role of duels. So it's clear that they're not just imagining sort of a formalized sport combat.
We are seeing their guesses about why a cavalier is included in what is a necromantic elevation.
Hmm.
Lictors are so far removed from their day-to-day experience. I imagine they are quite legendary and mythological. And so there's probably a lot of storytelling and retelling about what that looks like.
So the only thing we know for sure is that they both very solidly expect that the Cavalier is going to see combat, whereas Ortis never actually had to fight on the ninth.
Yeah. Iglamine is like, how do we protect Harrow? And Harrow's like, how do we beat everybody?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess we can, maybe if we can't see the actual combat scenarios, we can look at what their objectives are. So Iglamine is looking at Harrow's safety.
Mm-hmm.
Iglamine wants Gideon to be capable of protecting Harrow under any circumstance. Harrow wants to win.
Yeah.
And Harrow wins by trapping people. So I think that again underlines your kind of framing of it. This is touching on something. It doesn't matter. I think it's funny they talk about tetanus.
Yeah, they got tetanus in the soil.
So tetanus is a bacteria that is in the soil that is commonly transmitted through a penetrative injury with rusty metal.
Rusty metal is actually, this is a sort of fallacious association. Rust actually has nothing to do with it. It's just that if you were in a situation to put a piece of rusty metal through your body, you are in a dirty situation.
This tracks because the last time I got a tetanus shot was when I got a very, very bad cat scratch. Dirty dirt, tetanusy. Lockjaw is the way that it refers to this. Lockjaw is one of the symptoms of a tetanus infection.
And the fact that their tetanus experience is not, sometimes we have to do a vaccine, which is our tetanus experience, but sometimes you get lockjaw, means they're not managing tetanus especially effectively.
And it's in the context of death. It's not like this is easy to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
So interestingly, that implies that on the front lines, they have a lot less medical support for stuff that we think is totally fine and treatable now.
And that could point to super resistant tetanus strains that simply do not exist in our world. Tetanus spores can withstand boiling and freezing as well as common antiseptics. Tetanus is very hardy.
Fascinating. Any scientists who want to comment on tetanus spores traveling through space? Like let's say on the outside of a spaceship.
Can survive anaerobic environments.
Boom. So we have an organism that can very easily contaminate a planet that has never experienced it before.
Yeah, so almost certainly the tetanus. Well, I don't know, because there's been space bacteria. I believe we've found bacteria on asteroids, so it's possible that tetanus could have parallel evolved on other planets, but it's also totally plausible that tetanus got to other planets via human colonization.
Can we just take a second to talk about how cool it is that bacteria is found on asteroids? Just a quick second for bacteria on asteroids.
Oh, actually, looking this up really quick, it turns out in 2024, scientists reported finding bacteria on the Ryugu asteroid. My Japanese is 0. Sorry to all Japanese listeners. But it turns out that subsequent analysis revealed it was contaminated from Earth. So I take it back. We do not have space bacteria.
Yet.
Or at least we have not confirmed space bacteria. But we can sure put it in space.
Yes. If you want to learn about a fascinating story about the consequences of human contaminations in space, Isaac Asimov has a wonderful one. I will look up its name, but it is riffing on the behavioral changes that happen after a toxoplasmosis infection and the human behaviors that come out of that, and then the consequences that transmitting that to other species on other planets had. Really fascinating story.
This chapter gives us a little bit more insight on the role of the Cavalier because we learn that Ortis received education in etiquette, swordsmanship, although nobody respects his swordsmanship, and general scholarship. And there's concern that there isn't time to train Gideon in scholarship or in etiquette, and so she's only going to get the sword training.
Interesting priorities, because Harrow is going to study to be a lictor, but Gideon needs to be ready to fight.
Harrow does not think that Ortis's scholarship or Gideon's scholarship could possibly be of use to her because she is book genius.
Yeah.
The decision to train Gideon only in the sword aspect of cavhood is ultimately what gets her caught. because they do not put anything into teaching her the basic social graces of a cavalier, and she is spotted on like day 3.
And this is a thing that I think Harrow could have maybe anticipated. Like Harrow's making a conscious choice. And probably is aware that there will be consequences for Gideon being conspicuous in this way.
Well, and Harrow tries to manage that through the vow of silence.
That's right. Don't
Because
say anything stupid.
control will solve everything.
Control will solve everything.
I think it's interesting that it has to be Gideon and it can't be Aglamene, because that suggests that House Cavaliers have kind of a retirement age or something, because it would otherwise make sense for some House Cavaliers to be in advanced age.
Yeah, yeah. I imagine another possible reason for that is that there is a expectation of a certain degree of capability. And the fact that Iglamene's leg seems to be a botched repair because it causes her pain. She has to accommodate it in her movements routinely.
Oh, you know what? It might be the age mismatch as well. That it might make sense for somebody of Iglamene's age to be the cavalier to an adept who is of a similar age.
Like
But it
Harrow's
would be
parents.
weird for an adept of Harrow's age to have a very old cavalier, that would raise questions about why isn't a young cavalier available to her?
It's interesting thinking about all the different like social norms that are implied around how the relationship between adepts and cavaliers are supposed to be shaped and perceived.
Hmm.
We touch on that later down the road when we meet Magnus and Abigail, but we have all these different relationships, and this is the ninth's only understanding of this relationship. But I think it looks different in different houses to a degree because the role is a little bit different depending on what the adepts skills and responsibilities are. It's possible the role of Cavalier Primary like isn't always a big deal.
Mm.
Maybe what we're looking at is ancient Cavalier tombs of Cavaliers who were there in kind of a symbolic role during a very peaceful and boring time, to the point where their names were forgotten to history. Matthias Nonius, Ortis's grandmother, being exceptions to this. Maybe because they're more recent, maybe because they're more legendary, but it could imply that not every Cavalier is a big deal.
Yeah, and I think the deterioration from all metal swords to this oil amalgam sword kind of point to that as well, that there might not be as much conventional status or investment as there used to be. And we
Uh,
are seeing signs that that crisis, no matter how long it's taken to develop, is reaching a culturally acute level when we get that message from Iglamine at the end of this chapter. Iglamine says, "Things are changing. I used to think we were waiting for something, and now I think we're just waiting to die." So it seems like throughout Iglamine's life, she has felt this crisis, but her personal interpretation of this crisis has shifted toward the pessimistic.
do you think that the Emperor's summons were a catalyst towards this change? There has
Mhm.
never been a call for new lictors before in 10,000 years. That does seem like a drastic change of we don't have enough to continue this war anymore, so we're going to call on the noble children of the houses. Something is escalating out there and we don't know what's happening, but we can see some of the consequences here at home.
That's true. And if you were from a house that was facing a population collapse, that was already population dwindling, and then had this phenomenal extinction event, and then you also found out that the emperor is having the same problem,
Yes.
that would be alarming.
Anytime you see someone that has deified themselves vulnerable to the same things that you're vulnerable to, it feels extremely shaking. Like, um, there is a quote where Gideon describes Harrow's heart as a party for 5,000 nails.
What a weird insult.
My brain immediately was like, how many nails in a coffin? What's 5,000 divided by 200?
Oh, yikes. Yikes. I see why now, divided by 200. 5,000 divided by 200 is 25, which I don't think is enough nails to make a coffin. It is.
There you go, folks.
Jesus, Claire.
Your heart is a party for 5,000 nails.
So we leave off with this chapter with Aiglamene immediately reaffirming Gideon's agency in a way that she's been ignoring for this whole chapter. Aiglamene and Harrow have been talking as if Gideon isn't in the room, as Gideon is overtly saying, I haven't agreed to this, I haven't agreed to this, and they have made this agreement. There it's settled, as if her agreement means nothing. But in the last moments of this chapter, Aiglamene turns back to Gideon and tries to talk her into agreeing, signaling that her agreement actually is meaningful. They're pretending that it isn't, but Aiglamene does feel like it is.
I think Aiglamene is a great example of a kind of code switching. She behaves a certain way when she's talking to Harrow. She behaves a certain way when she's talking sincerely to Gideon and not in a performative way in front of Harrow. Because she doesn't talk this way when Harrow is in the room.
Harrow has left. Yeah.
She does not really openly reveal her hope for Gideon in front of Harrow. But I circle back to what I said before. I think there's a lot of wish fulfillment of Aiglamene wishing better for herself and projecting it into Gideon. She's given up for her own life, but we are seeing her wanting something better for someone.
She's wanting better for Gideon, and she's also not optimistic about Gideon's chances. Aiglamene thinks that this plan is more likely to serve Harrow's aims than Gideon's aims, but that it's also Gideon's last shot.
It's Gideon's last shot because it's Harrow's last shot.
So, having absolutely refused to give another single thing for this godforsaken house, Gideon is at the precipice of giving yet another thing for this godforsaken house. None Pod with Left Grief is created by Claire Beans and Han Koehle and edited by Han Koehle. Our music is Only Human by Philip Ayers. Today's cover art is by Eerna. Check out a link to her work in the episode description. Visit us at nunpod.com. That's NUNPOD.com. Thanks for listening.